I'm Raj Kumar. I'm President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. Welcome, everyone. It was great to see such a vibrant crowd come this morning. I think there's nothing like someone who's been in politics who is about to leave, but to generate a lot of interest in what you might say. We are here with Stephen Twigg, who is, of course, a member of Parliament. Actually, if we look back at your history, I think you have held elected office, if we include your student government role, for 30 years. And you just informed your constituency of West Derby that you would be stepping down from your role this summer. You announced it in July. Of course, Stephen Twigg is the chair of the International Development Select Committee here in the UK and has the responsibility to oversee DFID and the UK aid budget. And so there's been a lot of conversation about this. In fact, I've spoken to many people this week as I've been in London who are eager to hear what you have to say and are interested in part because you're leaving, but have said, Member of Parliament Twigg has long been known as an outspoken member. So we're interested to hear what you might come up with today in this session. And we will open this conversation to all of you shortly as well. So first of all, congratulations on the big decision to leave. You took the role after, I guess, 22 years in Parliament. You took the role as chair of the Select Committee 4 or 5 years ago now. You stood for election. I think Andrew Mitchell nominated you.
He did, yes.
And you said at the time, we need more scrutiny of DFID in the UK aid budget. Now stepping down and looking back over these last 5 years, what have you learned in this role as chair?
It's been fascinating. So in 2015, I'd been on the Labour front bench, both in government for 4 years and then in opposition for 5. And after that election, I thought I fancy doing something different. And the way that it works with our select committee system now, it's a relatively new system, is that there is election of the chairs by all members of Parliament. And initially, the party whips decide which party is going to get which committee. But once that's decided, then anyone from that party can stand, and 4 of us stood to chair the International Development Committee. And I had a little bit of a background in foreign policy. I'd run a small think tank for 5 years between 2005 and 10. I'd done some work with the Aegis Trust, who are the people who established the genocide memorial in Kigali to the Rwanda genocide, but I was by no means a development expert, so I slightly tentatively put my name forward. And I feel I've learnt an enormous amount over the last 4 years. I had an instinctive empathy, I suppose, for development, for the importance of the UK making the commitment that has now been made on 0.7%, the work of the Department for International Development. But I didn't come with a great deal of expertise, and I didn't come with a particular agenda, and I've learnt a lot along the way about what needs to be done.
You came in at a very interesting point in the history of UK aid, in the sense that the UK had agreed to this not 0.7% target. Had decided to go for cross-government funding, a 30% target of that. This idea that aid would be in the national interest came forward. And then during your tenure, you had many different DFID ministers, and of course now leading all the way up to Brexit coming up potentially in the next couple of weeks. So we want to hear about all of your views on all of that. But maybe we just start with a very big picture idea here, Stephen, which is DFID, for those of us who come from outside the UK, is widely seen as the leading bilateral aid agency. And I think even people within DFID feel that way, that this is the shining light of the bilateral donors of the world. Do you still feel that's the case? Now that you've spent the last few years looking closely at it, what is your assessment of DFID as an organization?
So I've chaired the committee for 4 years, during which time there have been 5 different DFID secretaries. Alok is the 5th Secretary of State for International Development. And I came at this with, in a sense, I was very proud of the fact that the Labour government in 1997 had established DFID, and this was a long-standing commitment to take overseas development out of the Foreign Office, learning the lessons of some of the scandals that had happened in the past in terms of tide aid, and to absolutely put DFID on its own footing. And I still think that is the right thing to do, and we might talk a bit more about that. And I think DFID deserves that reputation. And as we will talk, I'm sure, a bit more about Brexit and what its implications are, but assuming we do leave, I think actually one of the things that will give the UK some currency in the world is the work that we do on development, is our commitment to 0.7, and is the fact that we have a standalone department, the International Development Department, leading on all of that.
Well, from your lips to Prime Minister Johnson's ears, let's see how that goes. We'll get into that more in a moment.
Indeed.
One of the big features of this period in which you've been chair has been the move of DFID funding outside of DFID. I think it's currently about 25% of DFID funding that's spent by other departments, including the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and many others. How has that gone from your perspective? We hear a lot at Devex, and we've covered this, about people in the development community feeling there's replication, that there's a lack of knowledge in other agencies about how to spend this money, that maybe the focus on poverty alleviation has been reduced. Are those legitimate criticisms? How do you think it's gone?
I think they're very legitimate criticisms. I was saying to someone over coffee, I'm not a purist. I'm not someone who thinks the entire development budget must be delivered only by DFID. But I think it was a real concern that what you had in 2015 was an aid review led by the Treasury that set what I think was an arbitrary target of achieving this 30% through other government departments. And the test should be the ones that you implied. Is it about poverty reduction? Is it in line with the Sustainable Development Goals? Yep. And is the capacity there? So I think there is a kind of philosophical critique that I'm sure many of us in this room would share around the focus on poverty reduction and the global goals, but there's also, in a sense, a more practical, technical concern that the National Audit Office, which oversees all public expenditure in the UK, has expressed, which is just about the capacity of some of these other government departments and cross-government funds. So we did a big piece of work on this as a committee. We advocated essentially that DFID should be in the driving seat of all official development assistance. So not necessarily delivering it all, but signing it off. Because some of the issues that have, not all of them, but some of the issues that have resulted in negative media coverage in this country have been those that have been through departments other than DFID. You know, DFID are the experts on this, and the concerns you raise, I think, are very real ones. Now, interestingly, in the last year, the non-DFID proportion actually went down slightly. And Matthew Rycroft, the current permanent secretary, in evidence to us, to the Development Select Committee, said he felt 75% for DFID was about right, suggesting it shouldn't go below that. It is entirely unclear whether, with the change of government, we're going to see a further attempt to reduce the DFID proportion. I think that's one of the areas that we will be looking very closely at as a committee in this Parliament for as long as it continues.
Can we be confident that that number, that 75% staying with DFID and 25% going away, is a reliable figure? In other words, are there funds that are technically considered DFID funds, but that are actually being implemented elsewhere? Is this something you've looked at?
I see what you mean. Yes, no, I think the current figure at 75 is a reliable figure. I don't necessarily think it will remain at 75. So I don't think we can rely on 75 being the norm going forward. But I don't have any reason to suspect the figures themselves.
And you talked before about capacity, and one of the issues that we've heard quite a bit about is DFID staff feeling that they have to support other agencies to learn how to handle procurement and other issues. And of course, with Brexit, I think it's 200 DFID staff, 10% of the staff that will be seconded to other departments. How is that going inside DFID in terms of the staff capacity?
I think it's a real concern. I think there's a concern about capacity, and frankly, linked to that, a concern about morale. You know, when you've got so much uncertainty about the future of the department, the future direction the policy is going to take, that's bound to have an impact on morale. And obviously, the Operation Yellowhammer preparing for the possibility of a no-deal Brexit affects all government departments. But I think for DFID, this comes on top of them having lost some of their staff expertise. And actually, Rory Stewart, in his brief tenure as the Secretary of State earlier this year, when he came to us and we were asking him what he would want to change, he said he felt that DFID should have more in-house staff expertise. And what you've really seen over the last 9.5 years is, across most of government, austerity resulting often in spending cuts. Because DFID has the 0.7% commitment, we haven't had the spending cuts, but we have had constraints on staff numbers. And I think that has weakened the ability of DFID, even before Operation Yellowhammer, to provide the sort of challenge and expertise needed, both in terms of money being spent by other government departments and cross-government funds, but also on the ground in countries, in the management of contracts. I think there is a real concern, and I very much echo what Rory Stewart said to us back in the summer, that one of the things DFID needs to look is to have more in-house expertise.
What are you hearing from DFID's partners? Because implementing partners these days seem very unhappy with the current state of affairs, to say the least. What are you hearing from them about why that is the case? And what's going on inside the agency to cause it?
I get mixed messages from different partners. I wouldn't say it's uniformly negative, but it certainly isn't uniformly positive. Colleagues here will remember the supplier review that was held by the department when Priti Patel was the Secretary of State, and that was held in part in response to an inquiry that we had as a committee and to events around Adam Smith International at the time. And I know that many suppliers do feel that in responding to concerns that were raised at the time, a new set of problems have been created for suppliers. And I've certainly spoken with private sector suppliers who are more wary now of even applying for work with DFID and look to other donors to deliver the sort of work that they're wanting to do. So I think there is real concern, and if that continues, that could erode the very good reputation that I think you rightly said at the beginning, Raj, DFID does still have internationally.
Yeah, it is a big concern, I think, among many suppliers who feel they're being squeezed in the market today, that there really isn't a market here. It's created some interesting dynamics in the space, I think, for DFID.
And I've tried to use, obviously, as a select committee and as chair of a select committee, there's the kind of formal role of public hearings, evidence sessions, inquiries. But I've tried also to, in my time as chair, to have a more private role of brokering conversations. And one of the things I've tried to do is to bring some of the suppliers together with DFID so that those concerns can be shared. And certainly what DFID say is that they're actually getting more applicants per contract now than they were before the supplier review. So DFID do have a response to this, but the longer standing, well, not all of them, but a lot of the longer standing suppliers, some of whom I think are here today so they can speak for themselves, but do express those concerns to me. So I think there is an issue.
You think the politicization of aid, which certainly has happened in this country to at least some degree, have you seen that growing? Has it gone up and then ebbed? What's your view about the current state of the political dialogue around aid?
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating because what you had essentially was a Labour Party commitment to create DFID, 0.7%, started work 97, lots of progress but didn't hit 0.7 by 2010. David Cameron deserves a lot of credit. David Cameron, when he became leader of the opposition, leader of the Conservative Party, there were a number of issues where he shifted the long-standing Conservative position, and one of them was this one, and 0.7 was delivered by the coalition government with David Cameron as Prime Minister. What we've seen in parallel with that is increased media scrutiny of aid, quite rightly, but also sections of the British press that are hostile to at least elements of the aid programme, and that of course has coincided with austerity. So it's harder. I represent a constituency in Liverpool that has high levels of poverty and deprivation. And I remember when I became chair of the committee, a constituent saying to me, why are you banging on about poverty in Africa when there's poverty here in Liverpool? There is a scepticism in the public. There probably always has been, but I think austerity combined with greater media scrutiny and scepticism has brought that into sharper focus. So I think there is a broader point here for all of us in the development sector, is there's a set of arguments that perhaps we thought we'd won with British public opinion around the time of things like Make Poverty History, debt relief, debt cancellation. That argument needs to be won again.
Yeah, we had an event on Monday here in London, and Lord Mark Malloch Brown was speaking, and his view was that the traditional Labour-Tory divide on issues maybe is changing, and politics in this country are scrambling in a way that you see maybe more of a divide among those who are more isolationist or nationally oriented and those who are more globally oriented, and that might cut across parties. Yeah. How do you see the aid debate changing in a new politics in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to that, and I think that's probably similar in the States and in many other European countries as well. And I mean, we may come to Brexit, but I think I was saying when we were over breakfast, the Brexiteers, if you like, those that campaigned for leave in the referendum, some of them are in that camp that would be, charity starts at home and let's focus on our own communities, somewhat isolationist. But others, to be fair, wouldn't be. Someone like Michael Gove, I disagree on many things, but he's not an isolationist. And there are those who supported Leave who do have their own vision of internationalism. And I think that what will be important for those of us who care about development is that we can fashion a case for it in the context of Brexit. And I think that is something that we can achieve. But I have no doubt, and I think it's right to say this cuts across traditional Labour Conservative divides. I've no doubt that there is a section of opinion in this country that is pretty isolationist, and and that there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. The impact of the crash and austerity, I think, is certainly one of them. I think Iraq, I think the experience of Iraq makes people much more wary of what are seen as foreign entanglements, and that most directly and obviously applies to military intervention anywhere. But actually, people take it beyond military sometimes to other forms of engagement internationally, and people are just a lot more sceptical of everything. There's a sort of decline in trust in institutions and a collapse in trust in politics.
Do you think some of the Secretaries of State of DFID during your term here as chair deserve some of the blame? Meaning, have they given in to arguments that come from that wing of the politics of this country, kind of shown a willingness to concede that aid projects fail, or maybe sometimes fail enough that it feeds the flames? What's your feeling
sometimes
about
that has happened. I mean, I remember do you remember the Ethiopian Spice Girls?
Of course.
The Girl Effect, wasn't it? Was the program?
The name of the band is Yenya.
Yenya, that's it. And the evidence for it was so strong.
Yeah.
And initially the department stuck by it, and then they just pulled it. And I think that is an example where that did happen. I also think this whole business of the national interest needs to be interrogated. I think when I became the chair, and I picked up that this was an argument that was made. It was an argument that Conservative supporters of aid used, and I almost saw it in a kind of pragmatic sense of fair enough. If that's an argument that persuades people, but I worry now that it takes policy in the wrong direction, or has the risk that it takes policy in the wrong direction. And interestingly, from some of the research that I've seen, probably isn't a very effective way of persuading people to support aid and development. Actually, the evidence seems to be that people, if they're going to be persuaded, are persuaded more by moral arguments than they are by trying to dress it up as kind of in our best national interest. So I think there is a worry, and that was people like George Osborne and David Cameron that took the policy in that direction. That was the people who really believe in aid. It wasn't the aid skeptics.
And have you seen that so far? Have you seen funding going into areas that you would think this really isn't aid? This is more into the security sector, more defense related. What's your view about that?
I mean, are we not? The Royal Yacht apparently might now be classified as aid, as one of the news stories in the last few days. I would say, by and large, so far, we haven't seen as much of that as perhaps people feared. By and large, we've certainly, as a committee, expressed concerns about some of the cross-government programmes in terms of their transparency. There's definitely concern there. We've raised particular issues about the Prosperity Fund and where the money goes within the Prosperity Fund. But I think there's a risk that we could start seeing money being diverted and poverty reduction no longer being at the core of all of the spending. And I think there's been a bit of that, but I think there's a risk now there could be a lot of that.
I do want to get to questions from our participants here, but we do have to talk about Brexit first. When Boris Johnson was in a similar position to you, he left government. He left May's government, I guess back in May or April, and he was then able to speak very freely, and he was quoted talking about the opportunity to sort of take DFID's funds and use them in other areas, maybe merge it back into FCO. And your former nominator, Andrew Mitchell, the former head of DFID, came out and called him, essentially compared him to a pirate who was trying to plunder the ship of DFID. When you look ahead, there have been some people who are positive that, well, DFID's still here. Alok Sharma was appointed. The effort that could have emerged to bring DFID into FCO and make it no longer independent didn't materialize. Should we be feeling sanguine about that and feeling that this is okay and things post-Brexit will be similar to how they are now? Or do you think there's potentially some real dark clouds on the horizon?
I don't think we should be sanguine. I think it is still a risk. Actually, I pay tribute to Alok Sharma, who I think has used his first couple of months in office to make some very powerful arguments in defence of UK aid, and spent the summer using social media for that purpose. And I pay tribute to him for that. But the Prime Minister as you say, is on record as having supported putting DFID back into the Foreign Office. I've no reason to suppose that he's changed his mind. I think what happened is that he was persuaded that this wasn't a battle worth having when he took over as Prime Minister, and I hope that remains the case. And I really pay tribute to those in the Conservative Party who've defended the principle of having a standalone department. I think they've done a very good job so far, and all power to their elbows in continuing to make that argument. But I think there is a risk, and it might be, in terms of a kind of populist manifesto, that the Conservatives make a judgment, bluntly, that this could be a popular policy. Now, I suspect, to be honest, that if there is a popular strand around this, it would be cutting the money rather than changing the architecture of government. And actually, I think the risk to 0.7 as a commitment is much less. I think it's much less likely that they would look to reduce the 0.7 commitment. I think they're going to try and dilute it, but I don't think they'll try to actually abandon it. But they might take a judgment that's saying we're going to get rid of DFID and put it back in the Foreign Office could, along with other policies, be a popular one. Although, interestingly, after the 2017 election, when age was one of, if not the main determinants of how people voted, Priti Patel said that she felt that our commitment to aid was one of the ways potentially the Conservatives could win back support among younger voters. So there is almost a kind of electoral argument the other way that might lead them to keep DFID. So I genuinely think it could go either way. And because an election is likely to happen quite quickly, and frankly they're thinking about other things, not thinking about this, you could see a very short window in the run-up to the Conservative manifesto being written and published, during which this could go either way. And it's worth remembering that in 2017, there was a concern that Theresa May was going to make some sort of commitment that moved away from 0.7 or from DFID. And many people, including Bill Gates, rose to that challenge and ensured that the Conservative manifesto in 2017 didn't make that commitment. And we may well be in a similar scenario once an election is called here, quite possibly in the next few weeks.
You talked about undermining the not 0.7. Just a couple of weeks ago, the UN General Assembly, Alok Sharma announced these new climate change commitments. Do you see those as potentially an undermining of it? What's your view about them? For those who aren't familiar, these are the commitments to spend money on climate-related issues like biodiversity, but much of it through UK-based organizations, and some debate about whether this is really aid.
Yeah, so a couple of things. We did an inquiry and report on climate change, and argued for climate change to be a higher priority within the department, for climate-compatible development to be running right the way through all of UK ODA. So the greater emphasis on climate change, which I think started with Rory and has continued with Alok, is very welcome. However, as ever, the devil is in the detail, and I am worried. I think there are two worries. One is, could aspects of this herald a return to tied aid in terms of where the money's going to go? But the other is, in a sense, the opportunity cost. You know, if we are going to spend a lot more on preventing the extinction of species, biodiversity, all very important things, within the 0.7 envelope, that money's got to come from somewhere. And it is worrying if we're going to see a deprioritisation of other areas. There are various rumours going around, for example, that water and sanitation projects may be deprioritised, that other aspects of human development may be deprioritised. And I think that would be a very huge concern and could be a retrograde step.
My guess is there are very few British voters who have heard of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee.
Precisely.
But that may actually turn out to be the battleground for a lot of these issues.
Yeah.
You know, is that something you've looked at as a committee?
Yeah.
I wonder whether you think there's real potential that the UK might just ignore Development Assistance Committee sort of rules about what counts as ODA and just go in their own direction.
I think that's a big worry, and that's kind of what I meant by, I don't think the Conservatives will commit to abandoning 0.7. They'll seek to dilute it. And there's two ways you can dilute it. There's the kind of doing things which actually are allowed by the OECD, but I would argue are not as poverty reduction focused as other things. Or there's the more radical change, which is to have our own aid rules. Now, the 2017 manifesto for the Conservatives that I referred to did actually commit that they would seek to let me get this right, that they would seek to change the DAC rules and left open the option that they might go beyond them.
Right.
Penny Mordaunt, to her credit, as soon as it was clear they weren't going to get the full range of changes they wanted, she complied and didn't seek to go outside of the rules. And we looked at this in our inquiry into ODA, and we were very clear on a cross-party basis that we think the UK should not be working outside of the DAC rules. But it is entirely plausible that it could be a UK, yes, the UK is proud of its 0.7, but we make up our own rules in terms of what that means, and that would be, I think, would be deeply dangerous, not least for trying to persuade others to achieve 0.7, which I think is something we should be trying to do.
It seems like that's potentially a way around eliminating DFID as an independent agency, eliminating the not 0.7 is to do it underneath.
Absolutely. So you could, a sort of, one scenario is DFID stays, 0.7 stays, but the definitions for 0.7 are much, much wider than they should be, or than I would think they should be, and the proportion that goes through DFID goes further down below 75. I think that is potentially a scenario.
We began talking a bit about Brexit, but let's just complete that thought. So, run the scenario out for us as you see it from your current perch. How is this likely to go?
On Brexit itself?
Well, and what would the implications be, because there are many implications beyond just the politics about aid. There's even basic operational and implementation implications.
Yeah,
so play it out a bit for us, what you see.
So I think on Brexit itself, I think, by the way, everything I've predicted in the last 4 years hasn't happened. So, it looks to me that clearly there's not going to be an agreement. The government will try to bypass what's been described as the Ben Act to prevent no deal, and will almost certainly fail, probably because it'll end up in court. So we will wind up with a December general election for the first time in over 100 years. The last one was at the end of the First World War. And in that election, Brexit will be the dominant subject, and what happens beyond that will depend on the outcome of that election. And I think it's very hard to predict what the outcome of that election will be, because there will be all sorts of different factors at play. Firstly, the political parties might see it as an election just about Brexit, but the voters might not. Probably they will, but they might not. And secondly, there's the kind of every constituency has its own dynamic on this, and it's how the Leave voters and the Remain voters coalesce around candidates in different constituencies. And John Curtis, who's perhaps our most eminent psephologist, says it's 50-50 what will happen in an election. If he says that, I'm certainly not going to try to second guess it. But in terms of what that then means for development and humanitarian work and everything else, my worry, and some of us were discussing this over coffee, I think if there is, in a scenario where there's a change of government, so the Labour policy is to have a referendum, so we could remain in, but say you had a Labour government where we do still leave, I think all the instincts of the vast majority of people in the Labour Party and in the other opposition parties is to continue to be close with the European Union. So I think in practical terms, we would still work very closely with ECHO, with other European institutions in the delivery of development and humanitarian aid. I think a worry is that if there's another Conservative government, they may feel that politically they need to distance themselves from anything that has European Union in the title, and we may end up no longer cooperating with the European Commission and others simply because of Brexit, not because that's an inevitable consequence of Brexit, but because that's the present. That worries me. I don't think there's anything inevitable about that, and I think there are plenty of wise heads in the current government that wouldn't want that to happen, so it might not happen, but I think that would be one of the risks. Then, of course, you've got the much broader question of the UK's global reputation, our clout, our ability to have influence in broader sort of diplomatic terms, and certainly having been briefly at the UN General Assembly, I think there is a worry that all of this is weakening the UK's diplomatic influence. Now, that could change. Of course, nothing's immutable, but I think in the short to medium term, that is a big worry. And when you look at some of the development challenges, but also look at some of the humanitarian crises, one that I've done a lot of work on is Yemen. The previous Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, took a real personal interest in Yemen. I have a concern that many others have expressed to me that there isn't that focus anymore from the UK at the moment on that particular crisis, and I think that could be repeated in other scenarios as well. So I think there are There are the direct issues around DFID and aid, and I think pragmatically could be sorted, but dogmatically might end up not being sorted, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a much broader question of how influential we'll still be in some of these key areas.
Yeah, DFID and ECHO, for example, have been very aligned on the move to humanitarian finance
Exactly.
through cash
Exactly.
payments.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing where their alignment together has moved the whole humanitarian sector. And perhaps, to your point, might change in a new scenario.
Yeah.
Let's open this up to others who are here. Great to see already a few hands. We'll maybe take 2 or 3 questions at once if we can. We'll start with this gentleman here and move from there.
Thanks very much.
And just say your name and organization.
Yeah,
if you might.
David Pollock, Concilium Capital. We're a specialist corporate finance firm focused on impact financing. Given the risk from populism, how much do you think kind of UK voters actually understand about what DFID achieves?
Yeah.
And how much do you think it should be linked to explaining the SDGs, for example?
Brilliant.
Given that, you know, when there is an international crisis, the British public is known for actually being very generous.
Absolutely. No,
so there are kind
absolutely.
of 2 different sides to this.
Let's take another, if we might. Go ahead.
In a similar vein, Ben Leroy from Mott MacDonald, but previously DFID. I'm really interested in your views as a politician on, is there a path back to where we were on the political consensus behind aid and the public support for aid, and what are the things that we as a development community can do to really facilitate that?
That's great.
Great. And we'll take one more. I see my colleague Sophie Edwards in the back.
Hi, Stacey.
Hi, Steve. Question more about CDC actually, as something that's growing and growing. I get a sense from other NGOs as well that it's very hard to figure out what they're doing, what they're spending, that transparency isn't great there. Do you feel that that's something that IDC sort of has a handle on, or is it a growing area of worry? And do you also feel that DFID sort of has sufficient oversight over CDC?
Okay.
So yeah, I think if we were to group those, David and Ben's are really around the public perception of aid and the argument being made. Should DFID be doing more? Should we as a community be reframing the argument in some way? And particularly, where do the SDGs fit into that in terms of making the case to UK voters about the impact that DFID has? Maybe we can tackle that first and then get to CDC.
I was going to do CDC first.
Oh, please, do CDC first.
I find CDC, in terms of the work that we do as a committee, very, very open, very willing to engage with us. That is sometimes formal. They sometimes do come to us and give formal evidence, but they also do engage a lot informally, not just with the committee, but with others who take an interest in development. Clearly, it is absolutely right that they are properly held to account both by us and by the department. The increase in the capitalisation is considerable. But my experience, mostly, if I'm honest, is positive. For example, I mentioned our inquiry on climate change. I felt they came and made a good case for what they're doing. It does seem to me that they are serious about getting out of fossil fuels. You know, they have had criticism for past investments, but it does seem as though they've got a serious strategy around climate change and climate compatible development. So mostly my view on it would be positive. The honest answer on are DFID systems strong enough? I don't actually know is the honest answer to that, Sophie. I think that maybe is something I should take away and reflect on. And I say that partly thinking about the previous conversation about DFID's in-house expertise in general, and it may be that with the greater capitalisation they need to devote more to the oversight of CDC, and let me take that back and think a bit more about it. In terms of the broader debate and the public and political opinion and the SDGs, and do people know what's going on? I mean, I think the SDGs have the potential to be the main route via which we can win back public support because of their universal character. And it's quite interesting. I mean, we had this. We did an inquiry looking at the UK's voluntary national review, and the committee has been very critical of the way the UK has gone about that, and in particular that the SDGs really haven't featured sufficiently in domestic policy implementation, and we compared the UK unfavourably with a range of other countries, including probably most notably Germany in that regard. But if I think of my own constituents, and I mentioned the example of someone coming up to me in Liverpool and talking about poverty, actually the fact that the SDGs are just as much about poverty in Norris Green in my constituency as it is about poverty in the Sahel, I think is a way in which the sceptical elector in Liverpool could be persuaded to be more supportive of development. And I suppose that is coming back to the point about self-interest or national interest. I think that's more shared interest rather than entirely national interest versus entirely a moral argument. I think also, I still think most people in this country are, and as you rightly say, people respond positively with their own money when there's a humanitarian appeal. Most people, I think, are supportive in principle of aid. A lot of people have been persuaded that a lot of the money is wasted, and they worry about corruption, and they worry about money going to governments that either are themselves corrupt or allow corruption or with bad human rights and governance records. And I think demonstrating wherever we can that that isn't where the money's going, that the money is spent well, that it isn't wasted, and where it is wasted and where there isn't value for money, that that is tackled and rooted out. I think that is also one of the ways in which we can persuade a sceptical public. But I'm an optimist. I think people can be persuaded. I think there is probably a bit of a generational divide. I'm asserting that I'm trying to remember what the polling evidence actually shows, but I think there is clearly an idealism amongst a lot of young people. Climate change has obviously captured the imagination of a generation, and I think there is an opportunity to marry the development agenda with the climate change agenda in a positive way that can persuade more people to be supportive of development. So I'm not entirely gloomy. When I think back to kind of 99, 2000 and then 2005 and those big movements around debt relief and make poverty history, the faith organisations were a big part of that, particularly the churches and but other faiths as well. And I wonder whether that's part of the answer. And I say this as someone who's not religious myself, but I think part of the answer is mobilising faiths, and not just Christian, other faiths as well in this country, because in an era in which my profession is probably the least trusted. We've fallen behind all of those other professions that have traditionally not been trusted. Relying on people like me to persuade the sceptical public, it's not going to work, is it? I think if we actually have those that do still have higher levels of trust to lead this debate, we're more likely to succeed. And I pay tribute to this, the Campaign for Global Prosperity that is seeking to address this, seeking to bring for example, military leaders who can make the case for why investment in development is important, which I think in the States has been one of the ways in which the argument has been pursued, but also just bringing the nurses and doctors who've gone out as part of an Ebola response to come forward and say, I'm aid, this is what it is. I think that's going to help us to persuade a sceptical public as well.
You think DFID is doing its part to make the case? Is it shying away from the spotlight because of the media glare? Is it being proactive enough in terms of its communications?
I think it's got better, to be fair. I think it's when I was the chair initially, it felt a bit as though the department sort of kind of had quite a defensive media strategy, and I think that has changed. Yeah. I mentioned that Alok Sharma, the current Secretary of State, had a big sort of social media Twitter campaign over the summer making the case for UK aid. I think the government is much more proactive in responding to stories than it used to be. So I think DFID is doing a lot more, but I think it comes back to the point about the voluntary national review. It can't be left to DFID. I want the Department for Education to be out there doing stuff on the SDGs. There's this amazing primary school in Camden, Torriano, that has the SDGs covers the walls of the school, but it's the only school I've seen that does that. And if the Department for Education were sending out a message that learning about sustainable, if it should be on the school curriculum, frankly, and should be examined as part of that, and then it would move up the education department.
And you say that as a former education minister yourself.
Yeah.
Let's see if we have other questions from this side of the room. We'll take a couple. Go ahead, please start us off.
Hi, I'm Alex Martins, independent consultant. Worked on a number of ICAI reviews in the past. You mentioned the voluntary national review. I personally was extremely disappointed to see the lack of reporting on Goal 17, but
Absolutely.
in particular on policy coherence for development. The UK is not alone in that. Pretty much everybody is bad at it.
Yeah.
But to me, it seems crucial because you talked about Yemen.
Absolutely.
You can give as much humanitarian aid as you want, but if you're supplying arms at the same time,
Absolutely.
you might as well do nothing. You can fund climate change initiatives and still invest in fossil fuels, so you might as well do nothing. So how, in your view, how can we pressure the UK and indeed other countries to really report on those commitments and then be held to account for them?
Thank
Okay,
you.
let's take the one all the way in the back there.
Yes, thank you. We really welcome the IDC's focus on the SDGs and in particular the current inquiry on the SDG 16.
Yes.
And sitting under the SDG 16 is the global commitment to end all violence against children. World Vision's globally focused the campaign on this in every country office to help to achieve the 16.2 target. As the chair of IDC, how are we and other child-focused organisations doing on this, and what more could we be doing to be more effective?
Brilliant. Thank you very much
You've
indeed.
got 16 and 17.
16 and 17. That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, no, that's great. No, thank you very much. Let's take them in the order they were asked rather than the numerical order. So start with 17. A very important point. I don't know whether from your work you've seen a country that has been better on this in its voluntary national review. I'm trying to remember. Switzerland, right.
In terms of reporting.
Yeah. Because this is, I mean, you rightly cited, probably the two examples I'd have cited, actually, Yemen and climate change. We made the point in our climate change report that the direction of DFID policy in terms of climate compatible development is in sharp contrast to UK export finance and where the money goes in terms of fossil fuels. And the Yemen example is powerful and really does speak for itself. So again, to try and be optimistic, I hope the government will learn from the criticisms that we and others have made of the voluntary national review and get it right for next time. And and I hope next time isn't too far down the road. I do think the strength of the national review system is that it does focus minds. And I think part of the difficulty in the UK case was those minds didn't get focused till the very, very last minute. But obviously that then has to have a lasting impact on policy coherence. It's no good just getting it right for a review and then return to bad behaviour. What we said on it was that much as we respect as a committee, we respect DFID. DFID should not be in the driving seat of the UK's implementation of the global goals at home. That should be the centre of government, and in our system that's the Cabinet Office. But I guess in terms of policy coherence internationally, DFID's voice absolutely should be heard. Although in the Yemen example, it's actually DFID that's doing the aid, and it's other government departments that are licensing the weapons and making the foreign policy decisions. So it does require that sort of cross-government change of approach. I feel that's not a very satisfactory answer to your question. I think I'm agreeing with you that it's all grim, but in an ideal world it's going to get better. Is it likely that it will? I'd love to say yes, but I think that's a battle we still have to fight. And on 17, as you know, we've started an inquiry. Sorry, on 16, yeah. We've started an inquiry into that, which I hope will progress. But obviously, we are in the lap of the gods in terms of a general election. But we've had an amazing array of evidence on Global Goal 16 across the board, and absolutely the World Vision focus on violence against children is a really important part of that. And the examples of some of the conflicts, Yemen, Syria, conflicts in Nigeria and the Sahel, where violence against children is a consequence of conflict, obviously goes beyond those conflict situations. I mean, without wanting to just flatter you, I think you do a great job in raising these issues. And I think as the inquiry proceeds, it will be really important that part of Global Goal 16 is heard, because clearly Global Goal 16 has a whole set of other issues that we will also be addressing as a committee. And it may be that if time permits, we should consider perhaps some sort of a private event with members of the committee and World Vision and others, just to look at that in some sort of detail. I'm really keen, if there is an election, as I think there will be before Christmas, that I'm leaving as much of a legacy to whoever takes over the chair of the committee, and the evidence that we're amassing as part of that inquiry on Global Goal 16. I don't want it to get lost. There's a risk it'll get lost because that's just the way our system works. I'm really keen that it doesn't, and I hope that whoever takes over and the new committee after an election decides to proceed with that inquiry and complete it.
Well, an important part of your legacy, certainly for our audience at Devex, is your work on violence against aid workers.
Yeah.
So maybe we can just take a moment to talk about that,
Yeah.
what you learned in the process of producing that report, and what you think the state of affairs is for aid workers today.
Yeah, I mean, it's this was initially going to be a sort of one-off evidence session because of issues that had come to our attention, and then the evidence was so serious that we decided to have a further evidence session and then to publish a report. And a couple of things really. One is there is a little bit of an issue of getting clear on the statistics. Mm-hmm. So one of the things which we recommended, which the government is taking forward, is to get better clarity on the statistics. I think the second thing, and this is what really shocked us as a committee, was some of the specific statistics around health workers and the violence that's been committed in a number of different contexts against health workers, and the need for a specific piece of work going forward on that. And one of our recommendations was that the UK, this is an area where the UK can take a lead, and that the UK should convene a summit on this specific issue. And my colleague Chris Law from the Scottish National Party asked the Minister about this yesterday when the Minister was before the committee, and he committed to taking it away and looking at it. So he didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. And I think that is certainly something we will want to carry on pushing on, because clearly, you know, people who are aid workers or more broadly humanitarian workers, they're putting their own lives in danger in some of the most challenging contexts in the world, and the system needs to do everything it possibly can to protect them. And that is both those who are travelling from here and other countries to be aid and humanitarian workers, but also, of course, mostly it's local people.
That's right.
Mostly it's local people who are doing the work in those challenging situations, and regardless of whether it's a local person or an expat, they deserve exactly the same levels of support and protection.
And when you think of some of the biggest crises and opportunities today, think of Ebola and the attacks against aid workers there, or polio, the last remaining cases. It's really about those aid workers and whether they can get to where they need to get in the border region. We do only have a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to ask, you brought up the idea of your successor. What would your advice be to your successor as chair of the IBC?
That's great. It's a great question. I think the great thing about this world, and it's exemplified today, is that there is so much expertise in this world. And what I think I've really enjoyed about chairing the Select Committee is that the way in which Select Committees work is the complete opposite to the way in which politics is going. Politics is becoming more partisan, more tribal, damning of experts, ignoring of evidence, and yet Select Committees operate in precisely the opposite way. And I suppose my advice to a successor would be to absolutely look to the evidence and the amazing expertise that there is in the sector to inform the work that the committee does going forward.
I'm sure that's a very welcome message to this audience here. What about your own personal plans? So you're stepping down. What is the next step for you? Will we see you reincarnated into the development sector and the humanitarian sector in some way?
I hope so. I mean, I guess in terms of my particular interest, I mean, education has always been an interest both in domestic policy but now also in global policy. Human rights has always been something I've been very passionate about, and development more generally. So all offers accepted. If anyone's got a vacancy, get in touch.
Well, I have a feeling we'll at least be seeing your name in the pages of Devex in the months to come and the years to come. So thank you, and please join me in thanking Stephen Twigg.
Thank you.
And best wishes on what's next for you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.